someone like I myself have been in the past who's been struggling with symptoms and not feeling well, you can start to be a bit obsessive compulsive about your diet, about your supplements, about what's making you feel better or worse. So things that can preempt this can likely be very beneficial. Hey everyone, welcome back. Today I'm very excited to discuss a number of updates on diet, exercise, longevity, performance, all these things that we can use, these tools, whether it be how to tweak your diet, how to tweak your fasting, if you do or do not use sauna therapy, to improve your overall health and well-being. These come from this very robust feed of research that we track in PubMed. And here is an overview of what we'll cover today. Does exercise improve fatigue? Does it improve obsessive compulsive thinking? Does exercise improve brain-derived neurotrophic factor and therefore cognitive function? And can exercise improve migraine? We'll then pivot over to what the research is saying on the use of sauna plus or minus, or I should say exercise plus or minus sauna, the impact of sauna on longevity, and I have a really nice visual to share with you here, and cold exposure as it pertains to recovery, specifically looking at cold immersion, meaning cold water, as compared to cold air or one of these cryo, gas chambers, which is a question I've had for a while, and there seems to finally be an answer on this. And we'll also discuss a fascinating study looking at genetics and other personalized biomarkers to create an individualized diet recommendation as compared to a standard healthy diet recommendation to see, said simply, will doing a bunch of tests improve your outcomes, or can a diet that's been shown to be effective without any personalization be effective? We'll also discuss low FODMAP diet and fatigue pain as seen in fibromyalgia. And we'll continue to a question of, is there a fine line for can dietary restrictions fuel orthorexia or fear of food? We'll look at one study comparing low carb to low fat, and then another trial looking at intermittent fasting versus caloric restriction for weight loss. So there's a lot here to unpack, but there's also much to learn and much that can guide the way that we're using, or hopefully starting to use, some of these tools. So let's jump in and start with exercise. Does frequent exercise improve fatigue is the question this first study was attempting to answer. A summary meta-analysis of 81 randomized control trials, 7,000 participants whom exercised at least twice per week. And they found that exercise led to improved energy levels with a moderate effect size, meaning it's going to be moderately meaningful. And also that exercise was improved the most with moderate to high intensity exercise as compared to low or light intensity exercise. And this occurred also with a higher impact if strength and aerobic were combined as compared to aerobic alone. So moderate to high intensity and a combination of strength and aerobic seem to have the most impact on fatigue. Part of the reason why I feel this is relevant is, understandably so, when you're not feeling super energetic, one of the things you can do is shy away from exercise. And certainly we want to be mindful of not overtraining, but exercise is one of the best ways to improve your energy levels, and be careful not to shy away from strength training or high intensity exercise, because this seems to be where we can get some of the highest level of benefit from exercise. Any will be better than none, but don't shy away from the strength and from the high intensity if you're looking to optimize your energy. What about exercise for obsessive compulsive thinking? And I think this has a lot of relevance, especially if you're someone like I myself have been in the past who's been struggling with symptoms and not feeling well. You can start to be a bit obsessive compulsive about your diet, about your supplements, about what's making you feel better or worse. So things that can preempt this can likely be very beneficial. And in this meta-analysis, 6 studies were summarized in about 140 participants, and they found that regular exercise, in this case aerobic and yoga, were examined. There was a large effect size in improving OCD, a medium or moderate effect size in improving anxiety and depression. So, really important to keep in mind that if you're struggling with maybe food journaling or supplementing or just how you're feeling, and that sort of hamster wheel syndrome that you can fall into, which I've fallen into myself, exercise can be one of the ways that can help you almost hit the reset button of worry and some of this OCD-like monitoring of your health and your symptoms. And to the question of what form of exercise is best for increasing BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which you release when you exercise and helps the neurons better communicate with one another. It's literally a nerve growth factor, neurotrophic nerve growth. This study looked at 39 randomized control trials in about 2,000 participants. And as you see here, they looked at control versus high intensity versus aerobic versus strength versus aerobic plus strength. And they found that BDNF was improved or increased the most with strength, with a large effect size, second to that high intensity, third to that aerobic plus strength, fourth to that aerobic, and fifth to that control or nothing at all. So if you're looking to optimize BDNF, strength training and HIIT training may be items or forms of exercise you want to integrate into your plan. And this also ties back in with some of the improvements on fatigue. So maybe these types of exercise are both helping metabolically and neurologically. Now, this also begs the question, well, if I'm looking to improve cognitive function, does that mean I have to do a certain form of exercise? And this study gives us a practical answer. Summarizing 10 randomized control trials, they found that exercise led to improvements in cognitive function with a moderate level of impact, but any type of exercise was beneficial. And I'll quote, in this systematic review and meta-analysis, existing evidence from 10 randomized controlled trials demonstrated that any type of long-term exercise, aerobic, balance, strength, endurance, flexibility, and combination training with any intensities significantly benefited cognitive and physical performance in older adults with MCI, mild cognitive impairment. So it's important to delineate or remember the old saying, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So anything is better than nothing, and that's evidenced here. But if you're already doing something and you're looking to become a bit more refined, that's when, if you're not doing strength or higher intensity, you may want to integrate that into your plan. And what about migraines? I think anyone would be very happy to reduce migraines, as they can be obviously quite debilitating. In this meta-analysis of 21 studies in just under 1,200 migraine patients, they looked at exercise versus control, or exercise versus medication. And migraine frequency was reduced the most with strength training, 3.5 migraines reduced per month, and slightly less with high intensity training, 3 reduced migraines per month. And interestingly here, medication had no effect on migraine frequency. So even more reasons why, if you're not exercising, you should start. Now, similar to this, let's look at some research in longevity and performance. This one I loved, asking the question, does the addition of sauna to exercise improve cardiovascular disease risk factors? A randomized control trial in 47 participants with over one cardiovascular risk factor. They looked at strength and aerobic as compared to, so that's a form of exercise, it was a combination of strength and aerobic, as compared to that along with 15 minutes of sauna post-exercise bout. And what they found was, compared to exercise alone, the addition of sauna led to nearly a 3-point improvement in VO2 max. And that's a fairly substantial improvement in VO2 max for anyone who has tracked. And they also found that the addition of sauna led to an 8-point lowering of systolic blood pressure and an improvement in total cholesterol. This is one of the reasons why, and in our practice, we really encourage individuals, if they can, to use a sauna. And thankfully, there are some pod options that are really quite inexpensive, all the way up through something that would be more of an investment, like a barrel sauna that you could put in your backyard. But I think the Nordic countries have this right, wherein they make somewhat of a commonplace practice to use sauna. So this ties in with this next chart I wanted to show you. So one of the things that is also important to keep in mind, fitness level, VO2 max, this marker here that we just discussed, VO2 max correlates with longevity. And this study by Mansager, I believe is how you pronounce his name, and colleagues, what they're showing you here is that you have a higher chance of living, or a lower all-cause mortality, if you were more fit. And they're looking here at markers of cardiorespiratory fitness, which includes VO2 max. But the lowest line, meaning the highest chance of death, is in the least conditioned. And the highest line that you're seeing here, the more fit, the more protected you are, the less fit, the less protected you are, as examined by cardiorespiratory fitness and all-cause mortality. So this is part of the reason why we see in the other studies we've discussed on sauna, the ability of sauna to reduce all-cause mortality. It may be in part because sauna therapy improves VO2 max, and VO2 max correlates with all-cause mortality. So even more reason why, if you're not using sauna, try to make it something that you integrate. And remember, there are fairly inexpensive options out there. You don't necessarily need a gym membership or to buy sort of a larger barrel sauna or something like that. And sort of within the same theme, does sauna therapy reduce the risk of dying in those with inflammation? This was an observational study in 2,500 men who had high inflammation via HCRP, high sensitive or highly sensitive C-reactive protein. And what they found was that the elevation of CRP over 3 was associated with a 28% increased risk of all-cause mortality. Probably nothing new here. We've discussed on the podcast in the past that C-reactive protein is an independent risk factor for death from any cause, inflammation. However, look at this. The risk was completely reversed with frequent use of sauna 3 to 7 times per week. So really, really interesting research here showing that even if you are inflamed, you can mitigate and negate that risk with the use of sauna, perhaps in part due to the VO2 max benefits, perhaps in part due to the antioxidants, the heat shock proteins, the circulation, maybe through the relaxation and the improved sleep that sauna seems to impart. So more and more data pouring in showing the importance of sauna therapy as something to consider if you're looking to look your best, feel your best, live your longest. And when saying look your best, there are other data that have found that sauna therapy can actually improve skin. Aha. So what about this question of, does cold water work better than a gas chamber, a cryo chamber for performance? In this study, they summarized 28 studies, so it's a meta-analysis of 28 studies, and the intervention was after an acute bout of exercise. People were treated either with cold water immersion or with a control. Now, the control included active recovery or air cryotherapy or warm water immersion. And what they found was that cold water was more effective for most recovery outcomes, including soreness. Air cryotherapy was more effective for recovery of muscular strength. So on the whole, cold water immersion has the edge for recovery of muscular strength. It appears that air cryotherapy was more effective. So this answers, or at least partially answers, the question of which one is better. And now coming over to diet. This study I found fascinating. Will advanced testing to personalized dietary recommendations lead to better weight loss? This was a randomized control trial in 82 overweight adults. The intervention was a control diet, generic, but generic doesn't mean ineffective. Sometimes we associate generic to not being very helpful, but that's not always the case. So sort of a standardized and we could say tried and true dietary intervention for improving weight as compared to a personalized diet based upon genetics, blood, urine, and saliva. After 3 months, both groups experienced similar weight loss, fat loss, and improvements in insulin resistance and lipids. This also matches with the Diet Fits trial by Christopher Gardner, wherein he attempted to personalize dietary interventions based upon genetics and or metabolic markers and did not find it led to an appreciable difference. This is really important to keep in mind because there is such a burgeoning field of biohacking, individualized testing, and hopefully this field will get to a point where it has something significant to offer the healthcare user. But I have some major reservations because trial after trial after trial, I have just not seen there to be any significant improvement when going through the poking and the prodding, and most importantly, the expense of all this testing. In fact, when you frame it as such, I think one should be very careful with all of this testing. It costs a fair amount of money, and when you have a high this, a low that, a positive the other thing, for those who have an underlying predilection toward anxiety, this can actually start to make someone feel like they have a thing or things wrong with them and can really spur fear and worry and be unhealthy from a psychological perspective, as well as something that can be not great for you financially. So until we have better data showing that going through the gene, blood, urine, and saliva personalization of diet is more effective than other dietary advice, I would be very cautious. And for you as a healthcare consumer, this is important to understand because you will unquestionably be hit with all these marketing claims telling you how awesome a given test is. And we can figure out what your metabolism needs. We can figure out what your microbiome needs. But show me the data. Show me that this is meaningful. Not that you can display these academic differences in one gut to another or one person's metabolism to another, but that the effect size of these is significant enough so as to cause person A to lose more weight than person B. If they're losing the same amount of weight, you've just spent a bunch of time, money, and potentially worry for no benefit, which would mean you actually are at a net negative when you go that path. I'm all for precision healthcare and individual betterment, but we don't want to be a fool and just use testing because the lab company or the guru says it's better. This is a pervasive problem, and hopefully this study helps bridle you before you jump on this testing bandwagon. Okay, moving over to the low FODMAP diet for fibromyalgia. In this study, as a randomized control trial, 46 fibro patients were given either a control diet or an anti-inflammatory diet, which included no sugar, no gluten, no dairy, plus low FODMAP. So compared to the control, the anti-inflammatory plus low FODMAP diet led to an overall improvement in fibro symptoms, pain, GI symptoms, and fatigue. So this is a a tough control because they're really looking at doing nothing as compared to cutting sugar, cutting gluten, dairy, and along with this, a lot of processed foods, which may be where more of the benefit comes from, although there are data showing improvements from gluten-free and from dairy-free, but we have to be careful to parse that from people might be eating lower quality foods, and when they cut those out due to the gluten and dairy-free, they improve their diet quality. But nevertheless, those data do exist showing that a straight gluten-free diet improves certain health outcomes. Not something that I think everyone needs, and we need to be careful not to jump on that bandwagon also. But they're doing all that combined with low FODMAP. So that is a lot to change from a dietary perspective, but it can provide us with a starting point. If someone does have, let's say, pain and fatigue, whether or not they're diagnosed with fibromyalgia, could you trial 4 weeks, low FODMAP, no added sugar, no gluten, no dairy, and then reevaluate? Sure. And if that's helpful, then continue until you feel you have plateaued. Then really importantly, reintroduce. And that is something that I feel cannot be echoed enough. We want to make sure that you reintroduce. And this ties in with this next study. What is the prevalence of orthorexia or fear of food on various diets? This observational study in 420 women looked at a traditional diet, a vegetarian diet versus a low FODMAP diet. And based upon their questionnaire, 47% of those on a low FODMAP diet had a fear of food, 33% on a vegetarian diet had a fear of food, and 24% on a traditional diet had a fear of food. So why this matters is if the diet is not couched in the right way, people can start to form this fear of food, potentially because all the foods that were called to be avoided were labeled as bad, harmful, inflammatory, whatever it may be. And people don't go through this exercise as a shorter term contraction to heal and balance and then broadening things back out. And I often use the analogy of if someone sprained their ankle, we wouldn't want them to be running, but we also wouldn't frame running as something that's pro-inflammatory and damaging, therefore making someone afraid of running. It's a crude analogy, but I do think it applies here. And especially for FODMAP containing foods, many of these are quite healthy. So we want to be careful not to represent them as foods that will be a problem in the long term. The vast majority of people can reintroduce FODMAPs after they've gone through the balancing period. Sure, there may be a few they have to be careful with. There may be a total load that they need to be careful not to exceed, but certainly a wide adoption of FODMAPs back in the diet should be achievable. And now looking at low carb or low fat, very contentious question. 22 randomized controlled trials were summarized looking at 1,400 obese type 2 diabetics. So there is a certain population being studied here. Intervention was low carbohydrate versus low fat. And here's what they found. In the short term, 3 months, the low carb diet outperformed the low fat diet for lipids, glucose, and weight. However, longer term studies, 1 to 2 years, showed no difference between the diets for improving these same markers. And likely what's happening here is over time, you see a regression to the mean in terms of compliance. Hence, you're seeing the results become similar. And I feel this is important to keep in mind because some people will do better or have a preference for certain types of food. The more we make diet like religion, we make it harder for people to find the dietary advice that they need without something like slipping into orthorexia. So being a bit light-handed with our dietary recommendations is probably the best way to go because we don't want people to feel ashamed or to feel afraid. And also when we look at data like this, it's hard to say, well, the reason why everyone's overweight or everyone's diabetic is because of overconsumption of carbs, and it's just carbs, or it's just fat, or it's just meat. This tends not to be true when you have sort of a larger view on the data because you'll see so many points of contradiction to one of those absolutists types of dietary recommendations. And intermittent fasting is next. And this study looked at, is intermittent fasting more effective than caloric restriction for weight loss? Another meta-analysis of 24 randomized control trials, 1,700 patients, and they looked at caloric restriction versus a intermittent fasting protocol of alternative day fasting, a 5-2 method, or time restricted feeding. So a few different protocols there. And there was no difference in weight loss among the 4 different interventions. I think this is also important to keep in mind because, again, with diet and nutrition, it can sometimes look more like religion. And so you've got to make sure to have a fasting window of X, or fasting doesn't matter, it's all about calories. And at the end of the day, what seems to be most important is getting someone to the caloric and hopefully nutrient density intake that's going to make them feel good, perform well, and have a solid intake of nutrition in their diet. And for some people, they may actually do better with fasting. It may preempt them from stress eating or whatever it is. Whereas for other people, that may cause them to feel fatigued and irritable, and they do better perhaps with a few small meals throughout the day, aiming for more of a caloric restriction rather than a time restriction. So I think the way we can consider this is we have a variety of options to use, and we want to look at the individual and help determine and guide them toward what's going to be a win for them, rather than say, well, I'm the low calorie guy, so everyone that I advise is going to get low calorie. But rather, okay, I have a multiple choice here of 4 different options. Who is going to do best on which one? And let's match those people together. So that is the rundown on a handful of new studies, going through, and let's kind of do a quick recap here. Exercise improving fatigue, exercise improving obsessive compulsive disorder, exercise improving brain-derived neurotrophic factor and cognition. Some fascinating research on sauna for longevity and VO2 max, and the superiority of water immersion cold therapy as compared to gas cold therapy, sort of debunking the genetics and lab personalization of diet, at least for weight loss in this case, but there are other data showing similar outcomes. The ability of low FODMAP plus other healthy changes to improve pain and fatigue and fibromyalgia. The reminder to be important with the heavy-handedness of dietary recommendations due to diets leading to a 20 to 40% occurrence of orthorexia or fear of food, pitting low carb versus low fat, and realizing when you go out over 4 months, there doesn't seem to be much of a difference between the two, and similar for intermittent fasting versus caloric restriction for weight loss. So if you are trying to improve your health, I hope that these studies help give you some clarity and hopefully also some flexibility with the approach. I hope you found this as interesting as I did. This is Dr. Michael Ruscio, and I'll talk to you next time.